and welcome to Unwasted Pain. It's us again.
Yes.
It won't always be the two of us, but I'm glad to be back with Chris, my husband of 29 years almost. And this edition of Unwasted Pain, we've really kind of walked through our journey. And as we kind of segue into some different themes and different people and different interviews, we thought before we moved forward that we might maybe from a list of our the do's and don'ts of our experience, some things that you can only learn walking through a challenging season, but that if you could pass along to someone else and say, okay, hey, if you're in the middle of something right now that's challenging, I probably would avoid this. But here's some things that really did help. And so on that vein, we want to really talk about how do you keep a challenging situation from becoming more challenging?
Yeah, because I mean, the easiest thing in the world to do is go from bad to worse.
Right.
And so once something bad has happened, we're typically not at our best.
Right.
And because of that, there's just different things happen, and we get disappointed, we get discouraged, we get angry, we get frustrated. And those things typically don't contribute to wise decisions.
Right.
And so it's easy to make a split-second decision. It's easy to make a decision out of anger or frustration or fatigue. And in that, it's so easy for something to just escalate.
Yeah.
And you kind of set fire to the problem. And, what was originally a small fire becomes a big fire.
Yeah. Even as you're sitting here saying those kinds of things, different things going through my mind. But, one of the things that, again, we're 5 years looking back now and kind of in the rear view mirror of things you would do differently, things that by God's grace you did, and we didn't even understand the implications. But I think the first thing that comes to my mind of how do you take a small thing and make it a big thing is, I know for us, just the ages of our children and them really kind of in that season of launching out into adulthood. Our son was a freshman in college. Our daughter was a senior in high school. So they were both right in that season. And then the course of the last 5 years, they have been completely in the college realm and now out. That's a perfect example that, just in those realms when pain happens, it's not just you, it's the circle of people around you that are impacted as well. And I think sometimes I think we all care about ourselves too much and think about things in our own world, but to not forget that sometimes that pain can be, come not just from you, but how other people that you love are coping. And so your decisions and your choices in that moment impact more than just yourself.
Well, I'll borrow this from recovery world. A lot of times, whether it's Celebrate Recovery or AA, whatever type of recovery, they'll talk about recovery is never just an individual issue. It's never a solo issue. There's always, recovery impacts a circle of people. Recovery is a family issue. Recovery is a marriage issue. Recovery is, just all of the different people impacted. And when something, some type of adversity hits you individually, then everyone around you is feeling different things as well. And sometimes they run to your rescue and try to help. Honestly, sometimes, unfortunately, they might question you or even accuse you or be disappointed in you. So there's this collision of opinions, collision of emotions, and somehow or another, in the midst of a situation that is unstable, it's important for us to figure out how to model stability and allow enough time to pass for the emotions to simmer down. Because when we make decisions out of the intensity of emotion, there's a high degree of probability we can make the wrong decision. And so, oftentimes what you're trying to do in this situation is just stabilize initially, don't jump to conclusions, and then figure out how to get different perspectives that aren't in the heightened moment of emotional intensity, and then say, okay, God, where are you at in this crisis? You know, one of the things that we frequently say is, how do you find Christ in the crisis?
Yeah. So I think you just alluded to one of the things that you don't want to do is react. You want to respond. And that's a very different, a reaction is generally almost visceral and it is fast. Respond, to me, at least in the way that I define those two words, is a much more intentional thing. And I think, again, I think we're wired in a crisis, it's to react because, it's even all of the chemicals that are released in your body and the endorphins and the ways that you're, fight or flight, whether it's a literal or a relational or a physiological, it's all of those things. But if there's anything that I could say, generally a quick decision, unless there's a building literally on fire, like, generally waiting and just taking a deep breath is going to give you the opportunity to just discern if what your knee-jerk reaction is really the right reaction.
Well, and I think it's important to elaborate upon that point, and we've mentioned this maybe before briefly, but in that principle that you need to respond instead of react, God had given us a specific word that was in agreement with that. And the word was invite, don't fight. And I remember not really knowing or anticipating what the conflict was going to be, or imagining that we were going to be in a position where we were being asked to resign. But God had given us a word out of Zechariah chapter 4, verses 6 through 10. And in that word, it talked about, that this mountain will become a plain when you shout grace to it. And, that's kind of not necessarily, one's first reaction is that when, something's going wrong and you have this mountain that represents this impossible set of circumstances, that you shout grace to the mountain. And this principle came into my mind of invite, don't fight. And I think it's very fair to say that anyone who had known me previously in my 18 years of leading High Point Church just knew that I came from a background that was a little bit of an underdog background, a blue collar background, and very much had been taught how to fight, so to speak, that I was a fighter in a good way. And yet, there's always bad expressions of that. And there's times that fighter was very much used by God for good reasons. And then there's times that maybe you aren't walking totally in sync with the Spirit of God, and that fighter can have expressions that you kind of get out of bounds a little bit. But for me, in that moment where I'm sitting there really shocked and surprised by a decision by a group of trustees asking us to resign, that the Spirit of God came to me in that moment and literally said, I told you to invite, not fight. And I specifically said to this group of people, they said, do you have anything to say? And I said, well, I wasn't ever expecting this. And I wasn't expecting this. I was really thinking this word was for another group of people. But I feel like the Lord has told me to invite, not fight. And I think what that means is I'm inviting you to truly follow in this moment and trust what God has said to me, and trust that God has, kind of appointed me 18 years ago and hasn't unappointed me to truly lead us through this crisis to get to the other side. And that when we do shout grace, that this mountain is going to be pushed into the sea and it is going to become a plain. But in that moment, I didn't fully understand the magnitude of what God was asking me to say. And so when I invited them to follow, and I kind of made this promise to God and to them that I wouldn't fight, that was the hardest decision probably I've ever made. And it's continued to be the hardest decision over the course of 5 years, because the most natural thing that we want to do, kind of in our temperament and in our flesh, is fight for what's right, to defend ourselves. And so in that way, I really believe the Spirit of God was asking me, like you said, to respond, not react. I think honestly, they were very much expecting me to fight. And it was a situation that it required the initial decision. But the harder part is it required a daily decision to keep trusting God with the outcome, and to keep trusting God with, wait a second, I really believe, honestly, that if I would have fought for certain things, that I could have technically won the fight, but I could have potentially lost God's anointing upon my life. I could have potentially lost 5 years of a wilderness that, honestly, who wants to go through the wilderness? Again, if you go back to that biblical illustration of the Exodus, it was 11-mile journey that took them, 40 years, 11-day journey, not 11-mile journey. But now that we're 5 years into this, and I believe that we're in a place where the way I would describe it is we've stepped into the Jordan, the waters have parted, we're not all the way through, we're not on the other side, we can see the shoreline, the waters haven't closed behind us yet, but I'm beginning to get to that place to realize that what God has done in us is greater than what we would have kept had we chosen to fight. And then what God wants to restore is perhaps greater than what we could have accomplished had the crisis never come. And these are big statements. These are not statements that I say lightly. And so, in that, I would say, as we're talking about what didn't work, in order to talk about what does work, the fact that you picked this very first statement of respond, not react, I couldn't agree more. But also I would say, if we could talk about kind of, okay, once that decision was made and now we had to maintain the decision, now we had to walk in the decision, now we had to be in agreement and alignment with the decision. What did that look like? Because there was a certain moment there where, again, you're trying to obey God, trying to make the right decision, and I'm still thinking that there's the possibility that God will resolve this and that there will be some more immediate, more victorious outcome that, honestly kind of kept us in that role. But as we went through that and we saw that wasn't going to happen, then it became harder to actually agree with that decision. I've second-guessed that decision countless times.
Well, let's talk. I'm going to trust your memory is better than my memory, so that we come back to that in just a minute, because I think you're right. There is the decision in the moment, the action in the moment when that news comes, or when a decision's made, or when things are kind of on the line in whatever scenario you might be in. And then there's the daily living in that is what you're talking about. But before we go that direction, I think it's interesting. I think some people will like, well, you're a pastor, and so because you're a pastor, like, of course God gave you a word in the moment, and like there was a phrase, and it was even one that like was alliterated, because that's what happens when you're a pastor, right? But I think the other maybe thing that I don't want to have lost in this is that's 1,000% not true. That God wants to speak to every single one of us, and that God wants to protect every single one of us. I do think there is some wisdom in knowing that, yes, He is amazingly full of grace, and we can have never spent much time with Him at all, and He still shows up in the moment, of course. But man, having cultivated a relationship to hear from Him, that puts you in a much better place to hear from Him. But I also thought that what I hope that we would look back and realize and could pass along to somebody else is, a lot of times God is preparing you for what is to come. And it's easy in the moment of a crisis to just blank, to just, you're
You're in shock.
Yeah, you're so out of sorts that you probably aren't thinking, okay, let me go back and see what has the Lord been saying to me recently, or what are the things that have happened in my life, or words that have been spoken, or like, I think by God's grace, that was something that you were in tune to. And so we had, even though it wasn't what we thought, we did have an anchor. And though what we're going to talk about is that didn't mean the anchor was easy. But I guess what I'm just wanting to encourage people is, like, if you just come to a crossroad, in that respond, don't react, in that pause, think, pray, check your journal, listen, go back to messages you've listened, like, what has impacted your heart recently? Because there may be some way that you're able to see what that response should be based upon some things that maybe that you can only look in hindsight when you're now standing at a crisis and going, I mean, I was talking with a couple yesterday at church who just got a diagnosis of cancer, and they're standing so firm and so full of faith. And he said to me, I know that God was preparing me. And he was able to look back and go, okay, God, this caught me off guard, but it didn't catch God off guard. And therefore, I'm going to be okay, and I'm going to walk with this thing through faith. So that's a lot of words, but
Yeah, there's things that are sometimes uncomfortable to truly believe about God. You've got to trust that he's a good God. You've got to trust he's a good father. But it is uncomfortable at times to believe that sometimes he tests us to see what he can trust us with. And in hindsight...
Is that why you made me teach Genesis 22?
I give you all the hard passages. Hey, I haven't figured it out. You go figure it out.
Okay, great.
But, again, there's certain things that, people will say, well, I mean, do you kind of believe that God orchestrated this or brought this into existence? Did he allow this? And those are all kind of tricky questions. And even the word allow is theologically kind of tricky. I believe that in this particular situation, yes, the crisis came, but there were multiple ways we could have responded to the crisis. Not just us, but other people involved, trustees, the church as a whole. And I do believe there was a way to solve the problem in a healthier way, to unify the church, to protect the church, to care for all parties involved that were both inside and outside the church. I have to believe that was possible. I don't believe that, in our particular situation, God wanted to take a great work and see it splinter and, so many people get hurt in the midst of the crisis, sheep get scattered, people lose, kind of their faith in God's church. But what I would say is there's some truths that when you read them in Scripture, you're like, oh man, that's one of the greatest truths ever. Like, I mean, I'm going to hang my hat on that. But when it happens to you, it's a lot harder to do. Genesis 50:20, the story of Joseph, when it says, what man intended for evil, God meant for good. Right. Well, honestly, even though I'd never, yes, I see the principle, but until you have to live it.
Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, right?
Yeah.
We like that one.
Right, exactly.
But, yeah.
But in that way, I would just say, it's fine to say, oh, bless your heart when it's someone else. It's fine to say, I'm praying for you when it's someone else. It's fine to even quote the right verse or try to encourage, but it really doesn't require much change in your own life. For us, we still had to say, we're going to hang on to this word even though we don't fully understand it. We're going to allow what this word says to be our source of hope, even though we don't know how it's going to be fulfilled. And I would say, people ask the why question all the time. And I don't know that I will ever fully have a satisfactory answer to the why question. But I do know God's ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, that he is trustworthy, and that in the midst of this, here's some things I know that don't work. I know running from God was not the solution. I know doubting God, was not the solution. I know being the victim was not the way out of this. I know complaining and just, griping and, in biblical terminology, grumbling, was not the solution to this. I know quitting on God was not the solution to this. I know that, just getting mad and angry at the church and blaming the church wasn't the solution to this. There were so many things that, yes, I feel the feeling. I validate the feeling. There were a lot of times in my prayer life with God, very verbal, intense, loud, just get the feelings out of me. Times that, I would just kind of scream at God and say, why? And help. And then those times that even the scripture says that, there are moans and groans that are they're too intense to articulate. But we just got to remember there are some things that are never going to work, that the voice of the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. In every one of those things I just mentioned, not one of those things was going to build my faith. Not one of those things was going to increase faith, hope, and love in my life. Not one of those things was going to help me see God play a role of restoration in our life. Not one of those things was going to help us forgive. Not one of those things was going to, help us become a better person. So, sometimes we just need to make it more simple and go, whoa, wait a second. This doesn't work. Yeah. This is hard, but it works.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I think it's I don't know. I was going to say normal or human. I don't know. I guess human might be the most accurate word. When things feel so bad, you do start without a really strong anchor, questioning God. I thought you were good. How could a good God let this happen, kind of thing. And even just see people that, sometimes you use the expression that most of the time that when a theologian becomes liberal, it's because they become immoral first. Like there's things that happen, not necessarily in a morality world in this context, but that like in a weak moment, we shift our theology, or we all of a sudden what we thought that we believed, because we can't see clearly and because we don't know the end of the story, we jump to these massive conclusions. And I was just thinking, even just yesterday before we recorded this, I taught out of Genesis 22, and there was some text going along from our dinner group, and I was just like, man, everybody is fixated on, I don't think I could put my son on an altar. And I'm like, you're missing the point. Like that's not the point. God didn't put that in there for you to wrestle with whether or not you would put your son on an altar. I'm like,
none of us could.
Yeah.
None of us.
I'm like, there's 7 million things between that and where you are that God might want you to put on the altar, like your selfishness, your cell phone, your how you like what your job, your how you feel powerful. Yeah, like there's so many things, but like somehow where the conversation went was like this debate about God and whether that was fair or unfair. And I'm like, that's what we do. We just kind of start redefining things when it feels too big for us to do. Like, well, that seems too, I don't think I could do that. Well, therefore, there must be something with God that I don't understand. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but...
Well, it's it's that dynamic of the difference between a God-centered approach, a God-centered theology, and a man-centered theology. Okay, a God-centered theology is He is good, He is sovereign, He's in control. When it doesn't make sense to us, He still has a reason, and He's going to bring good out of it. And I'm going to trust Him regardless. A man-centered theology, where it starts with man at the center, then when something doesn't make sense to my present circumstances, I'm going to trust there's something wrong. Okay? And when there's something wrong, then I might now change my belief system temporarily in order to right the wrong. And so what we've got to do is go, no, 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 no. I've got to elevate my thinking above a man-centered approach, and I've got to try to see the crisis from God's perspective. When He sees a crisis, He sees the big picture. He doesn't just see the moment in time. God is more interested in what He's going to do in you and through you than in your comfort zone. You know, like, is the moment our comfort zone gets disrupted, then we begin to oftentimes become accusatory. And so now what we've got to do is say, no, 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 no. He's much more interested in transformation that will come through this circumstance than just changing my circumstance. He's much more interested in how I become like Christ and what He does through the process than just delivering me from it.
Yeah. Well, it is one of those times where if I could encourage anybody to what you believed before the crisis about God, if you were in a healthy place, hold on to that. He has not changed just because you can't see the outcome. And I think you talked about, that in that moment of invite, don't fight. And in the moment that felt like, okay, we'd heard from the Lord, but then it got really hard because it was not a week or a month and 2 months and 3 months.
Tell them how much I loved you encouraging me.
Yeah. So one of the things that might not work.
Yeah, this is different things for different people.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that is true. I think it's important that when you're going through something challenging, to normalize the fact that if this is the first type of crisis you've walked together, whether that's with a friend or whether that's with a spouse or what in your work dynamic, whatever the dynamic is. I mean, you and I had been married 24 years, was it? Something like that?
Basically.
When this happened. And we had not really had to experience this level of pressure and this level of disruption and this level of pain. And so we had to just normalize, like, I've never been in this situation before. I don't really know what I need. And then things that I tried that didn't work, would be like, well, you know what, Chris, like, I know it's really bad, but, I know you've lost your job and I know we've moved and I know we don't have an income and I know, there's a whole big list, but I'm like, but at least we're all healthy. Like, somebody else has cancer and we don't. And so like, it's fine. And you are not feeling it at all.
Honestly, I was like, this does not help me at all.
Yeah, and you literally said that, like, this is not helping me at all. Yeah. And I would say, not everybody hits a crisis in a healthy marriage.
Sure.
Okay, so there are times where crisis happens, and it's now a crisis on a crisis.
It's like a house of cards. It begins to fall apart because of the way it's built.
And so you were in a place to be able to say, Karen, that's not helping me. And I was in a place to be able to receive that because But you were
like, well, why doesn't this? Like, it helps me. And I'm like, I'm glad it helps you. But right now, just hearing that someone else has it worse than us does not help me because it feels as bad as it can possibly be to me. And I don't want someone else having a worse situation to somehow or another be helpful to me. Yeah. God bless them. Let them have a wonderful situation. I hope God heals them. But God heal me. God deliver us. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, So I guess I just say that the word normalize is something that I think you and I use a lot, but I think it's actually pretty helpful because I think if you, let's just say for you and I, because we were at a healthy place, we could have that dialogue without maybe inflicting more pain on one another. We could have that at a health and go, okay, I need to regroup and I need to, I need to figure out something. And so, so we did. But for that person or that relationship that was already strained, and then crisis comes, again, sometimes if you can just step back from where you are and go, okay, you know what? We weren't in a perfect place, and now we're in this crisis. I'm just going to acknowledge that's not where we weren't where we wanted to be. And can I just take that in context? And what can I do right now? Can I just suspend that? And can we together be a team through this?
Well, and so, yes, I did say, hey, that's not helping me right now. But I did kind of give some guidelines and go, listen, if I'm just having a bad day, just give me permission to have a bad day.
Yeah, yeah.
I said, now, if I have 2 bad days, try to get me to do something, encourage me in some way. Let's, kind of poke on me a couple of times. Don't allow me to have 3 bad days in a row.
Yeah.
Because I was honestly legitimately afraid of slipping into some type of depression. Yeah. And so we did create some kind of ground rules. And then, literally what I needed was inspiration. For me, there were things that, like, my greatest fear was losing the vision that God had given me. And so in order, when, you're fearful of losing something and you feel empty because of that, like, I needed more vision pumped into me. So even though we didn't necessarily have money, it was, well, we need to go to this conference and let God speak to us. Or, I watched countless documentaries, just because I just needed to see story after story after story after story of someone having some type of crisis, some type of adversity, overcoming that adversity. And, sometimes it was a godly person, sometimes it wasn't a godly person, but you just learn from the way people are resilient. Mm-hmm. And so, when I think about this, I just I wrote down a few things here that I think are just good, simple reminders, okay? A lack of vision isn't working. Mm. So, like, you got to still maintain a vision for your life. God hasn't given up on your life. He's not given up on his vision for you. God hasn't given up on his promises for you. So let me just go with that next step. Giving up isn't working, all right? Sure. Quitting isn't working. Mm-hmm. Less commitment isn't working. Less conviction isn't working, where I'm just, I got burned, I got hurt. Was that really worth it? I'm not going to give my life to this again. Why even care? Like, it would be so easy to not care. Mm-hmm. But yet that's not, God continues to care. Mm-hmm. And if I want to be like God, I've got to care. Mm-hmm. And then, like, things like this, well, criticism isn't working. Right. Complaining isn't working. Condemning isn't working. And you know what? Canceling isn't working. Mm-hmm. It never works to cancel someone, because God never cancels someone. And so then you got to go, well, what is working? Well, guess what? It just goes back to faith, hope, and love. Mm-hmm. Faith is that confident trust that God is who he says he is and that he'll do what he says he'll do. Faith is not blind faith. It's not just, taking this leap into the darkness. No, it is confident trust in who my God is, and that he will actually fulfill his promises. And so it's faith, hope. Hope is that confident expectation. Hope isn't wishful thinking. There's a source of confidence because, again, I'm not in this alone. You were in this with me. Our kids were in this with me. Godly men and women who are friends were in this with us. But most important, God was in this with us. So we had a source of hope because we didn't run from God. We ran to God. But then love. There were so many decisions that we made based out of what does it mean for us to position ourselves to still receive God's love and still give God's love. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things that I think was a secret to our success in walking through this, if you can even use that terminology, was that we always still found a way to serve. We always still found a way to be serving the Lord and serving people, and that prevented us from just being me-centric, you know.
You touched on a couple of different things that that I just little pictures that might be helpful. You were talking about being afraid of slipping into a depression and like having some kind of boundaries, some kind of gutters in the bowling alley to just try to prevent that. There are simple things like literally I just remember there would be days that, and it depends on like the time of year and what part of the country you're in and all those things, but that it would just be like you could just stay inside and in your little bubble of pain. And if you just walked outside and you realized the sun is shining and the world is moving on around us, and like, yes, I hurt, but there's a bigger picture and a bigger world out here, and we are gonna come through this. Yeah. And so I think there's sometimes even just like forcing yourself to be outside, forcing yourself to get some exercise, like just, yes, there were days that it was like, I just know I'm doing this because it's the thing that I'm supposed to do. I don't feel it. I don't want to. I want to stay in bed. I don't want to go see anyone. I don't want to. But I think those kinds of things. And then you're talking about love. You got to pull some people in. Yeah. That, and this is tricky. I'm just going to be honest, because people will disappoint you. Mm-hmm. There were a few people that like were heroic in our journey that showed up and they shouldn't have had to. And why did they? And I don't even know. And how did you even know? And why did you even care? And yet they would show up. But there were so many people that you're like, well, where is so-and-so? Like, we haven't heard from them in months. Where did that friendship go? Like this had nothing to do with this, but so you got to be careful because people will disappoint you, no doubt. But at the same time, you still got to invite people in, and you still got to let people love you and not act like you don't need love.
Yeah, let me even be more specific. The majority, without a doubt, will disappoint you. Mm-hmm. But don't focus on the majority. Yeah. The minority will hold your arms up in the battle. The minority are the key to your victory. The crowd's never going to be there for you. The core will be there for you. It is absolutely essential. You learn, through a crisis who your friends are, and you learn who they're not. And some of those friendships got to be redefined. I don't think you should burn a lot of bridges. And I think you should be open to what, restoration looks like. But I would just say, again, here comes the word normalize. We need to normalize that the majority will disappoint. We need to focus not on those that disappointed. We need to focus on those. There were less than 10 people who truly, I don't know how we would have gotten through what we got through apart from those 10 people. They are heroes. Mm-hmm. They are people I will forever remember. They will people I will forever be grateful for, people I will forever tell their story. And now I want to be one of those people to other people in their time of adversity.
What you just said, maybe we've been married a while, because I was just thinking something very similar to that I think one of the things that kept us going through it, and this doesn't matter if you're in the ministry professionally or not, but we just wanted to remain blessable. And I think that was something that governed every decision of like, we can't understand a lot of what is happening or why or how, or like it was just felt like a scene out of a bad movie. But nonetheless, it didn't matter. We've said this in another podcast. My response is my responsibility. And so that, like, if nothing else, if you just are like, Father, whether the enemy sent this or whether you're testing me, I don't know. But what I know is you see how I'm responding. And so just if nothing else, sometimes that fighter in you can't fight. Maybe, it's a divorce, it's a custody battle, it's a this, and sometimes you have to just being ugly doesn't ever really help you anyway, but like there's just times where we just had to be quiet, like not even just peacefully be able to defend ourselves, but we're like, okay, you are our defender and you are just. And the only thing that I can control right now, I can't control any of my circumstances, but by golly, at the end of the day, I'm going to walk through this in such a way that God sees me and says, well done. And there's something to that I think definitely can help steady you through the middle of a lot of junk. But then to what you just said, we have the phrase, you created the phrase of going the extra mile to prove love works. And that should be, as if you've been through a crisis and you knew it was the few and not the many that helped you through it, that should make you one of the few. And hopefully over time, the few will become the many. But that is something that God can forge in you, that you will be the person that shows up. You will be the person that moves towards someone in pain, because most people don't know what to do, don't know what to say, and they just kind of do the back dance.
I think it's 2 Corinthians chapter 1. It could be 1 Corinthians. But he talks about take the comfort that you have received from God and comfort others with it. And like in the first 9 verses, he uses the word comfort 10 times. And so once we have received the comfort of God, once we've received the comfort of God through other people, then that produces a healing in our life. And then now we have a responsibility to give back and to comfort others. No one's going to live this life without adversity. The reason why this podcast is called Unwasted Pain, in a sinful, fallen, broken world, there's going to be some pain, all right? But God never wants your pain to be wasted. In many regards, he wants us to fail forward. Don't fail the same way twice. Learn from your failure and move forward. And so in this, I would just encourage everybody, don't focus on what isn't working. Focus on what works. And, honestly, it's why we say only love covers a multitude of sins. Only love never fails. Only love works. And when we focused on that, there were still hard moments. There are still hard moments. But it kept us believing, it kept us hoping, and it kept us loving. And in that, you begin to sow, you begin to plow some new soil. And you're cultivating some good soil. And along the way, you're having to remove some rocks and some thorns. But you can have complete and total confidence that a new harvest is coming. And I believe that new harvest can be even greater than the old harvest because of what God did through the crisis. He is a God of restoration. He's a God of full restoration, not partial restoration. A God of complete restoration, not partial restoration. And then on top of that, he's even a God of double restoration, or double portion, sometimes it says. And so believe big. And be a good steward of the adversity. And then I promise you, you will get through it. And you'll get through it and you'll be a better person. And then you'll be better for other people in their moments of adversity.
Well, we're almost there. And for those of you, I think one of the things that kept me going, if you have, day one of your crisis, there were days that even, and I don't know if this fits in that same category of this doesn't help me to you, but I'm like, it will never be as bad as it was that first day. Like, we are still breathing, we are still kicking, we are still moving forward, and we are, whether we're walking or crawling or running from that point of pain, we are moving away from it, and the healing will occur. So I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that that our hearts are with you any way that we can be a resource to you. We want to be, and hopefully this podcast has been that. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.